man had just held up his bank and threatened to kill someone in the lobby. The teller, Jesus Garcia-Lopez, had handed over $23,000 to save those lives. Then the investigators asked him what happened, and he had almost nothing to say. Not because he was too shaken to speak, because there was nothing he was willing to tell them about which side of the counter he was really on. You have been robbed before, in small ways. A charge you did not recognize. A friend who borrowed and never paid it back. And almost every time, your first instinct was to trust the person telling you what happened. The victim gets the benefit of the doubt. That instinct is old, and usually it protects you. This is a story about the rare moment it does the opposite. Start with the note because the note is where it began to fall apart. An FBI special agent and a San Diego police officer were the first to respond to the call on June 6, 2018. They followed standard procedure. They talked to the victim. They looked at what the robber left behind. And almost immediately, three small things did not fit. The first thing was the money. A typical bank robbery in the United States nets a few $1,000s, sometimes far less. Most people who rob a teller are not planners. They are desperate, and they take whatever is in reach in the 10 seconds they are willing to stand there. This one had walked out with more than $23,000. That is not what a panicking stranger grabs. That is a number that suggests the robber knew exactly which drawer to empty and knew, before he ever walked in, that it would be full. The second thing was the note itself. It did not just say, "Give me the money." It named the upper drawer and the lower drawer at the teller station, and it set a specific instruction, 30 minutes before anyone was to call for help. A random robber does not know that a teller keeps cash in two specific places. A random robber says, "Give me everything," and runs. This note read like it had been written by someone who understood the inside of a bank teller's station. Someone who knew where the money actually sits. The third thing was the teller. When investigators sat down with Garcia-Lopez, the man who had just had his life threatened, they expected what victims usually give them: shaking hands, a flood of detail. The robber's height, his voice, his eyes, the exact words on the paper. Being robbed at a counter is one of the most frightening things that can happen to a person at work, and the mind does a strange thing with fear. It records everything. Victims often cannot stop talking, because the moment keeps replaying and every replay brings back another detail. Garcia-Lopez gave them almost nothing. The robber came in, asked for money, gave a note. That was the whole statement. One of the agents later described it as strange how brief it was. Think about the difference between remembering something and inventing something. A person who lived through a terrifying event has a flood to draw from. A person who is hiding what really happened has to be careful, because every extra detail is another thing that can be checked, another thing that can be caught in a contradiction later. So they say as little as possible. The silence was not trauma. The silence was caution. None of that was proof. A quiet victim is not a crime. A specific note could be a coincidence. A large haul could be luck. But investigators do not need proof to get curious, and the FBI San Diego Violent Crimes Task Force got curious. They opened a case, and they kept Garcia-Lopez in the corner of their eye. They did not accuse him. They just stopped assuming he was only a victim, and they started pulling threads. Here is where you have to understand what the three men thought they had built. Garcia-Lopez had been working at that branch for about 18 months. Long enough to be trusted. Long enough to know the rhythm of the drawers, the cameras, the response times, how much cash a station could hold and when. He shared a place with two other young men. One was named Joe Mares. The other was a man named Aldo Gomez, who stayed with them often but whose name was not on the lease. That last detail was not an accident. It was the whole plan. The idea was simple, and on its face, almost clever. Garcia-Lopez would stack his drawer with as much cash as he could before his shift. Mares would write a demand note good enough to make the robbery look real and force the largest possible payout. And Gomez, the one man not officially tied to the apartment, would walk in off the street, hand over the note, take the money and disappear. On paper, the three of them barely connected. A teller, his roommate, and a third man who lived nowhere, at least according to any document. 3 roommates, 1 robbery. And the one person the bank would treat as a victim was actually holding the door open from the inside. If it had stayed that clean, it might have worked. The bank had been robbed. The money was gone. The teller had a story. Cases like that, With a robber who walks out clean and no inside informant, can stay unsolved for a long time, it did not stay clean. Think about what a real conspiracy requires. It requires that nobody celebrates too loudly. It requires that the money stays invisible. It requires that 3 young men who just came into a pile of cash act for weeks and months like nothing at all had happened. No new spending, no trips, no posts. Nothing that a stranger looking at their lives would ever notice. That is the part almost nobody can do. Money is one of the hardest secrets a person can keep because the entire point of getting it is to use it. Sitting on a stack of stolen cash and living exactly as you did the week before takes a discipline that most people, especially young people who just pulled off something they think was brilliant, simply do not have. The reward is the thing that gives you away. Not long after the robbery, task force officers found a video posted on social media. In it, Garcia-Lopez and Mares were in Central America, spending like men who had suddenly found money. The trip did not match the paychecks of a bank teller and his roommate. Investigators now had 2 of the 3 faces linked together in a video out of the country, looking exactly like people with a reason to leave and money to burn. The secret they most needed to protect was the one they had posted for anyone to see. Remember the note, the one written well enough to fool a bank. It went to the lab, and the lab found a fingerprint on it. The fingerprint belonged to Joe Mares. The note that was supposed to make the robbery convincing had a signature on it. Not a name, a print. The same friend who wrote it to sound like an anonymous stranger had left his own hand pressed into the paper, and then handed that paper to the very people whose job it is to lift fingerprints off evidence. The cleverness of the note was real. So was the carelessness underneath it. Now the picture was almost complete. Investigators had a teller who gave up too much money and said too little. They had a roommate partying abroad on cash that came from nowhere. They had that roommate's fingerprint on the robber's own note. There was still one missing piece. Who actually walked in and handed over the note? Who was the man on the camera? The plan had a hole in it by design, and that hole was Gomez, the man with no address anyone could point to. Months later, that piece arrived almost by accident. Police got a real-time tip about a suspicious vehicle. Officers from the El Centro Police Department pulled the car over. Inside was Joe Mares, and beside him was Aldo Gomez, along with other passengers and signs that something was not right. The officers brought both men in and called the FBI case agent, who had been living with this file for months. The ghost in the plan had just been found sitting in a car next to the man whose fingerprint was already on the note. In the interview room, Gomez confessed. He said he was the man who robbed the bank on June 6. He had been staying with Mares and Garcia-Lopez, but because his name was never on the lease, he had been the hardest of the 3 to connect to anything. He was the invisible one. That was his entire value to the plan. And now the invisible one was talking. He did not stop at the one robbery. Gomez admitted to 2 more bank robberies later that year, ones his friends had nothing to do with. Sit with that for a moment. The man they had chosen precisely because he had no footprint, precisely because he seemed to belong to nothing, had been the most active criminal of the 3 the entire time. They thought they were using a nobody. They were working with a serial bank robber who had simply not been caught yet. Then Mares confessed to writing the note. He admitted he had actually researched what a demand note needed to say to make a teller hand over the maximum amount of cash. That was why it named the drawers. That was why it set the timing. That was why the haul was so large. He had studied the problem like a student. And the very details that made the robbery succeed were the same details that made the FBI suspicious in the first minute. The better he made the note, the more it screamed that a stranger had not written it. And finally Garcia-Lopez, the teller, the victim, turned himself in and admitted what he had really been. Not the man on the wrong end of the note. The man who made the note possible. The one who loaded the drawer and then stood there and let his own life be threatened on paper for a story the 3 of them had written together. The arrest of the invisible roommate was what let investigators see the whole shape of it. 3 friends, 1 agreement, a teller to load the drawer, a writer to craft the threat, a stranger to carry it out and vanish. In 2019, Mares and Garcia-Lopez were sentenced to prison, with supervised release to follow and ordered to pay back what was stolen. Gomez was sentenced in May of 2020, and his repayment covered not just the inside job, but the 2 other banks he had hit alone. The plan that was built to keep them apart on paper ended, with all three of them named in the same case. Pull back from the counter now, and look at what actually undid them. It was not a security camera catching the crime. It was not a silent alarm or a dropped mask. It was the human parts of the plan. A statement that was too short, because a guilty man does not know how much a frightened man says. A trip that was too lavish, because money is unbearable to hold in silence. A note written too well, by someone who could not resist proving how clever he was, and who left his fingerprint on the proof. They were not caught by the robbery. They were caught by everything they did around it. And that is the part worth keeping. You are wired to trust the victim, to believe the person who says the harm was done to them. It is a good instinct. It holds most of the world together, because most of the time the person who says they were hurt actually was. But the same investigators who nearly extended that trust to Garcia-Lopez knew to watch for the tell that no camera records. The story that is too smooth. The account that is strangely thin. The grief that is a little too quiet. The sudden money that no one can explain. Not to assume the worst of everyone, but to notice when the shape of a story does not match the shape a true one would have. A man walked into a San Diego bank and slid a note across the counter to a teller. The whole plan depended on you believing that the teller was the one being robbed. He was the one who wrote himself into the story as the victim. And in the end, that was the exact role that gave him away.